Hello, my name is Courtney. My father won $35 million in the lottery, and that same night he told me to pack my bags and get out. I was erased from the family like I had never existed. But what cut deeper than being thrown into the street was watching him hand everything to my sister Barbara, who smiled as if she had finally won. 4 days later, the same man who called me useless was standing outside my office door, begging for help. How does a family fall apart so fast? And why was I the only one left out? Life in Houston had always been steady, predictable, and ordinary for me. I worked long hours, paid my bills on time, and came home to the same quiet little house I'd lived in since my mother passed. My father Kelly still bought scratch-off lottery tickets every week. It was almost a ritual for him, something that gave him a flicker of hope, but never any real payoff. I used to tease him about it, saying, "Dad, you'd be better off investing that money in coffee." He'd laugh, crumple the losing ticket, and try again the following week. None of us thought those small pieces of cardboard would ever change our lives. But then it happened. One evening, as the sun set over the Houston skyline and I was helping clear dishes from the table, Dad suddenly leaped to his feet. $35 million! He shouted, holding up the ticket like it was the Declaration of Independence. "Courtney, do you hear me? 35 million!" His voice cracked, half joy and half disbelief. My sister Barbara rushed over, nearly knocking her chair backward, and took the ticket from his hand to check the numbers herself. "Oh my God, Dad!" she squealed. "It's real! You actually did it!" For a moment, laughter filled the house. I felt my heart pounding, not just from the shock of it, but from the thought that maybe our lives were about to turn a corner. I whispered to myself, "Finally, maybe we can breathe. Maybe Dad won't have to worry anymore." I remembered something Warren Buffett once said, that money doesn't change people, it just shows who they already are. At the time, I thought it meant we would see my father's generous side shine. But within minutes, the air shifted. The joy on his face hardened into something colder. He looked at Barbara with pride, then at me, as though I were an unwelcome guest in my own home. His laughter stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the news of the win itself. That night we sat down at the dinner table, a meal that should have been a celebration. Dad cleared his throat, tapping the glass with his fork as though he were about to make a wedding toast. Instead, his words hit like a hammer. "I need to make something clear," he began. "Courtney, you won't be part of this new chapter." I froze. My fork hovered above the plate. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You've never contributed," he said bluntly. "You've stayed here too long, relying on the scraps of what your mother and I built. I've let it go. But now things are different. I want you to find your own way. Tonight, we turn the page, and you're not in it." Barbara sat back, a smug smile tugging at her lips. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes told me she'd been waiting for this moment. The humiliation burned through me. I remembered Eleanor Roosevelt's words, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." But that night, I did feel inferior. The man who was supposed to protect me had reduced me to nothing in front of my own sister. Hours later, when the dishes were cleared and the laughter from the neighbors faded, my father stormed into my room. He didn't knock. "Pack your bags, tonight." His voice was clipped, sharp, like a landlord evicting a tenant. I stared at him, still in shock, then reached for the old suitcases under my bed. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into them, not caring if they were folded or wrinkled. Every zipper felt like a nail sealing my coffin. He held out his palm. "The house key." The sound of the metal key dropping into his hand was louder than thunder. It was the sound of betrayal, final and undeniable. Barbara's voice floated down the hall. "Be firm, Dad. Don't let her guilt you." I could hear the neighbors' porch lights clicking on as I dragged my bags to the door. Their silhouettes appeared in windows, curious eyes watching me leave like a scandal was unfolding. I felt exposed, like I'd been stripped bare in front of the entire block. This can't be real, I muttered to myself. Families don't do this. But they had. The Houston night wrapped around me like a heavy blanket as I stepped onto the street. The air was humid, cicadas buzzed in the trees, and the weight of my suitcases dug into my arms. I turned back just in time to see my father locking the door, sliding the bolt into place. That lock had kept me safe my entire childhood, and now it was shutting me out for good. Blood is thicker than water. I'd heard that phrase my whole life. Standing there, it felt like the biggest lie I'd ever believed. Panic rose in my chest. Where would I go? Who could I call? My bank account wasn't much, and Barbara would make sure my name was blackened before sunrise. I looked at the sky, desperate for direction, but no answer came. Then my hand brushed against the necklace I wore, the one my mother gave me before she died. The cool metal against my skin steadied me. I clutched it tightly, whispering, "Help me, Mom. Give me strength." I didn't know it then, but as I stood alone on that street with nothing but 2 suitcases and a necklace, the story was only beginning. 4 days later, the same man who had thrown me out would be sitting outside my office, tears streaming down his face. The next morning, I woke up with my suitcases still sitting by the door of the motel room, their zippers half open like they were mocking me. I hadn't really slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's hand slamming the door shut, the lock sliding into place while Barbara's voice carried down the hallway, telling him to stay firm. I almost convinced myself it was just a nightmare. People don't discard their children overnight, not decent people anyway. But then my phone buzzed with a neighborhood text thread. "Congratulations to Kelly and Barbara's family." Neighbors were already talking, planning a celebration. My chest tightened. It wasn't Kelly and family. It was Kelly and Barbara's family. Even before the champagne corks popped, I'd already been erased. By evening, I stood outside our house, my old home, watching rental trucks unload tables, balloons, catering trays. The yard was dressed like a wedding reception. I hesitated, part of me hoping my father would come outside, look me in the eye, and admit that last night had been a mistake born out of shock. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd pull me aside and whisper, "Courtney, I lost myself for a moment. Of course you belong here." But when the music started and neighbors cheered, I realized that hope was foolish. Inside, guests lifted flutes of champagne. Dad stood by Barbara, beaming, as if she had delivered the fortune herself. He raised his glass and called for attention. "I want to introduce my family," he said proudly. He named Barbara. He named her children. He even acknowledged her friends who had come from Austin. But my name never passed his lips. I shifted uncomfortably in the back, unseen by most. A woman from down the street, Mrs. Larson, spotted me and smiled. "And who's that young woman?" she asked cheerfully, gesturing toward me. My father's eyes slid over me like I was a stranger. His words were clean, cold, and final. "She's not part of this family anymore." The room shifted. Conversations paused. A ripple of whispers spread. My cheeks burned hot enough to scorch. Humiliation in front of strangers felt worse than the eviction itself. It was as if my bloodline had been cut out of a photograph, and everyone else was watching the ink dry. I thought of Maya Angelou's words. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." That night, my father showed me. But the evening wasn't done with me yet. Later, Barbara walked onto the stage they'd set up in the backyard. She carried a framed deed in one hand and a polished car key in the other. "Tonight," she announced, "I want to honor the man who raised me. Dad, you've always believed in me, and I promise I'll protect what you've built." She turned dramatically and handed him the symbols, one of the house, the other of the new luxury car parked in the driveway. My father's smile widened. He took the items and without hesitation placed them back into Barbara's hands. To the daughter who truly deserves it. The crowd erupted in applause. To them, it was a sweet gesture. To me, it sounded like gunfire in my chest. My mother's kitchen, my childhood bedroom, the laughter that used to fill those walls, all signed away in a single moment as though I'd never existed. I stood frozen, clapping slowly with the crowd so no one could see the shaking in my hands. Barbara walked past me, leaned close, and whispered where only I could hear. "It's my turn now. Watch and learn." Her perfume lingered after she walked away, sharp as the sting of betrayal. I gripped the edge of the table, refusing to let my body betray me. No tears. Not here. Not where they wanted me broken. I reached under the table and clutched the necklace my mother had given me. Her face came to mind, steady, kind, unshakable. I pulled strength from her memory. I reminded myself that this wasn't just betrayal, it was theater. Barbara had choreographed every piece, the applause, the plaque, the car keys, even the whispers in the audience. Money doesn't unite people, it exposes them. In this country, families have been split apart over far less. And suddenly, I understood Warren Buffett's warning in a way I hadn't before. Money doesn't change you, it magnifies who you already are. Tonight, it magnified Barbara's greed and my father's weakness. In southern Texas, folks often say, "Money can't buy class." That truth hit me harder than the humiliation itself. As the party swelled, I made a silent choice. If I couldn't stop them tonight, I'd survive it with my dignity intact. I sat tall, breathed slowly, and forced myself to study every detail, every word spoken. Eventually, I slipped out while the applause still filled the room. My footsteps on the gravel driveway felt louder than the music inside. On the way to the street, I overheard one of the men chuckle to his wife. "Well, looks like she'll need to find her own lottery ticket." Laughter followed like nails dragged across metal. I kept walking, passing the gleaming car in the driveway. Its headlights reflected back at me, bright and unblinking, as if the machine itself were laughing too. Behind me, Barbara's voice rose above the crowd again. "It's my turn now." The words carried across the yard, cutting through the night like a blade. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I walked down the street, each step heavier than the last. But inside me, a thought hardened into stone. If they erased me in front of everyone, then one day I'll return where everyone can see. I dragged my 2 suitcases down the cracked sidewalk until the yellow glow of a neon sign buzzed above me. The vacancy light flickered, half burned out, like even the motel itself was embarrassed to stay open. I pushed through the glass door, its frame sticky from years of neglect, and stepped into a lobby that smelled faintly of disinfectant and cigarettes. Behind the counter sat a clerk who didn't bother lifting his eyes. To him, I was just another woman down on her luck, one more story he'd never asked to hear. I slid the last of the cash I had across the counter, and he handed me a plastic keycard without a word. That exchange, so transactional, reminded me just how far I had fallen in a single night. No longer a daughter in her father's home, just a guest buying shelter by the hour. The room was worse than the lobby, a stained carpet spread across the floor carrying ghosts of old spills. The air conditioner hummed unevenly, rattling in a battle it was clearly losing against the Texas humidity. I dropped my bags onto the bed, its mattress sagging, and stared around. The contrast to the home I had grown up in was suffocating. There, every corner held memories of my mother's touch. Here, nothing belonged to me. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was peeling in places, forming patterns that looked like continents breaking apart. It matched the way I felt, like my own world had split overnight. People always said, home is where the heart is. But tonight, I had no home, and my heart felt like it had been evicted right along with me. When I finally unpacked, I reached into the smaller bag and found the necklace my mother had given me. It wasn't expensive, just a silver chain with a small pendant she bought at a flea market years ago, but it was the most valuable thing I owned. I ran my fingers over its surface, whispering her name like a prayer. Pulling out clothes, I found another memory hidden between folded shirts. I could still hear my father during one particularly hard year when bills piled high and food seemed scarce. He'd gathered us around the table and declared, "If I ever hit it big, I'll take care of all of you equally. You'll never have to worry again." Back then, I had believed him with a child's certainty. Now those words felt like a cruel joke. Betrayal from a stranger can wound you, but betrayal from your own father carves deeper. He hadn't just turned his back on me, he had lied to me for years, promising loyalty he never intended to keep once fortune came knocking. I sat on the edge of the bed, turning the necklace in my hand, thinking about how sudden money doesn't change people, it reveals them. I thought of something Oprah Winfrey once said. Lots of people want to ride with you in the limo, but what you want is someone who will take the bus with you when the limo breaks down. Well, the limo had finally arrived, and instead of inviting me inside, my father had shoved me off the curb, leaving me to watch as Barbara slid into the leather seats and drove away. I pulled the thin curtains shut, but they did nothing to block out the roar of traffic from the highway. Each truck that passed shook the walls, making me feel even more temporary, like I could be swept away without notice. I sat in the dark, listening, fighting against the sting in my eyes. I wanted to call someone. I thought about dialing a friend, but what would I say? That my own father had disowned me over money? That Barbara was now holding the deed to the house where I grew up? I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. And pity has a way of eating away at your dignity faster than hunger ever could. So I stayed silent. The hours dragged as I wrestled with myself. First came the loneliness, the hollow kind that presses down on your chest until you can barely breathe. Then came the bitterness, sharp and hot, reminding me of every moment Barbara had been praised while I was dismissed. But somewhere beneath all of it, a small spark of resolve flickered. I whispered into the quiet, "If I give up now, Barbara wins. If I survive tonight, I can survive them." I repeated those words like a mantra until the trembling in my hands eased. Eventually, I walked to the window. The city lights blurred through the glass, distorted by the dust that clung stubbornly to the pane. I pressed the necklace to my lips and whispered, "Mom, I'll prove your faith in me wasn't wasted." It struck me then that this motel, with its sagging mattress and buzzing light, was more than just a place to collapse. It was my battlefield's ground zero. This was where my pain was beginning its slow transformation into power. I pulled a notebook from my bag and opened it to a blank page. With the stub of a pencil, I wrote a list. Find allies. Protect myself legally. Keep my dignity intact no matter what. Each word steadied me, anchoring me in a world that had just tried to throw me away. I thought about the broader picture. In the United States, stories of elder financial abuse and family betrayal show up in headlines more often than people want to admit. Sometimes it's children stealing from their aging parents. Sometimes it's siblings cutting one another out of inheritances. And sometimes, like in my case, it's the parent who betrays the child. Too many people live in silence, ashamed. But I promised myself my story wouldn't end that way. I leaned back against the headboard, the paper resting in my lap, and whispered into the stale motel air, "This isn't the end of me." Not by a long shot. That night, I thought I had lost everything. My home, my family, my place in the world. But as I stared at the notebook, the necklace still warm in my palm, I realized I was holding on to the only thing that mattered: the truth. The days that followed my exile to the motel moved slowly, each hour heavy with a mix of disbelief and fury. As I tried to gather my bearings, I began noticing patterns I had overlooked before. Barbara had been orchestrating this long before my father ever held that lottery ticket in his hand. She wasn't simply the lucky daughter standing at his side. She had been rehearsing for this role, wearing the mask of the dutiful child. She cooked for him, plated meals with exaggerated care, while Dad chuckled like he hadn't had such attention in years. She organized his appointments, reminded him of things he'd already forgotten, even corrected him when he stumbled over numbers in front of reporters. To the outside world, it looked like love. To me, it looked like a script. One evening, while my father laughed at a story Barbara's friend was telling, I saw her slide a stack of papers across the table, almost hidden beneath dessert plates. Dad, distracted, scribbled his signature at the bottom without reading a single line. She leaned close, her voice soft, syrupy, yet laced with control. "You need someone who understands money, Dad. Don't worry, I'll protect the family legacy." Protect. That word rattled in my ears. It wasn't protection, it was possession. Every syllable wrapped another chain around him, another knot tied tight. I thought of an old American saying I'd heard from my mother's generation: "Not all that glitters is gold." Watching Barbara now, I finally understood. Her glitter was nothing but fool's gold, polished manipulation dressed up as loyalty. With the image of those papers haunting me, I tried to find some comfort in reaching out. I called a few friends, people I'd known since school, the kind you think will stand by you when the world tilts. My voice cracked as I asked if I could stop by, even just to talk, maybe stay a night until I found my footing. The responses came like rehearsed lines. "Oh, Courtney, I don't want to get caught in the middle of family drama." Another said, "Maybe it's better to let them sort it out." The words stung worse than silence. Then I overheard something that crushed me further. At a grocery store, standing behind two women in line, I caught Barbara's name. They were giggling, whispering that she had told them I was unstable and jealous of her success. My stomach dropped. Not only had she taken my home, but she was taking my reputation too. In America, image is currency, and just like money, it can be stolen. I thought of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words: "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I felt that silence wrap around me, cold and suffocating, isolation layered on top of betrayal. Bitterness filled the cracks where trust used to be. One afternoon, desperate for a breath outside the suffocating motel room, I walked into a small coffee shop a block away. I ordered the cheapest coffee, sat in the corner, and tried to gather my thoughts. That's when I heard her voice. "Barbara." She was behind me, phone pressed to her ear. Her tone was light, playful, dripping with confidence. "Yes, we'll move the money into another account. He signs whatever I put in front of him. He doesn't even blink." Then laughter, loud, careless, cruel. My chest tightened. My heart pounded so hard I worried the whole cafe could hear it. She wasn't just taking his money. She was dismantling his dignity piece by piece. I gripped my paper cup until it crumpled. My anger screamed for release. I wanted to march up, confront her, shout the truth into her smug face, but I held still. Proof. That's what I needed. Outbursts vanish. Evidence speaks forever. I stared into the dark coffee, telling myself over and over, patience. Let her keep spinning her web. The more she weaved, the more likely she'd trap herself. Older Americans lose millions every year to scams and predators. Sometimes those predators are strangers with slick sales pitches. Sometimes, heartbreakingly, they share your blood. Sitting in that cafe, I realized my father had become another victim in those statistics, and Barbara was the predator holding the pen. That night, back in my motel room, I spread out my notebook and began mapping Barbara's moves like a chessboard. Each action I remembered, a whisper here, a staged smile there, became another piece on the page. I whispered to myself, if Barbara can manipulate him with lies, I'll protect him with truth. The bitterness inside me hardened into resolve. Despair began to retreat, replaced by a quiet determination. I would not fight her with shouting or rage. I would fight her with patience, strategy, and evidence. I leaned back, pen still in hand, staring at the shaky motel ceiling. My jaw clenched as I whispered into the empty room. I didn't know it yet, but Barbara's web of lies was about to pull me into a war I couldn't ignore. Barbara called me one afternoon with a tone that pretended sweetness but carried steel underneath. "Dad wants you to come to dinner," she said. "It'll look bad if you're not here. We're family, after all." Her words dripped with irony. I knew it was a setup. Every instinct told me to decline, to spare myself another scene. But I also knew that sometimes the bravest thing isn't avoiding the theater. It's stepping onto the stage knowing the script is rigged against you. So that evening, I walked back into the house that once held my childhood laughter, now dressed up with expensive new furniture and freshly polished silver. The dining table stretched long, lined with glittering plates, crystal glasses, and candles arranged to look like something out of a magazine. Guests were already seated, neighbors and business acquaintances Dad had gathered to show off his fortune. I scanned for my place and found it at the very end of the table, a broken wooden chair with a missing rung. The symbolism was brutal. Everyone else sat comfortably in cushioned seats, their cutlery gleaming in the candlelight. I lowered myself onto the splintered wood, the uneven legs wobbling under me. I caught a few smirks flickering around the table, eyes darting my way, and then back to their plates. Barbara tilted her head, voice bright with false cheer. "Sorry about the chair, Courtney, but you don't mind, do you?" Her words landed like a slap. I forced a thin smile, my voice steady. "I'll manage." The humiliation cut deep, but I told myself I wouldn't bend. I wouldn't give her or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. The evening dragged through courses of food that tasted of nothing to me. I pushed steak around my plate while conversation buzzed over my head. Guests praised Barbara for how well she'd been handling Dad's affairs. "She's so capable," one woman gushed. "You must be proud." My father beamed, nodding as though Barbara had earned the very air we were breathing. Toward the end of the meal, when coffee was being poured and desserts placed, Dad reached into his wallet. He pulled out a folded bill, crumpled from the back pocket where it had likely been sitting all week. Without ceremony, he flicked it toward me. The bill slid across the polished wood, stopping just shy of my plate. My father's words followed, heavy and sharp. $50. Enough for a cheap room. Don't expect more." The room went still. I swear I could hear the flicker of the candles. My eyes followed the green paper lying between us, an ocean of betrayal in that small distance. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others pressed their lips tight, half-smothered laughter trembling behind them. It wasn't about the money. It was about what the gesture said. That I was worth less than a stranger, worth less than a tip to a waiter, reduced to pocket change. In this country, we grow up hearing that family takes care of their own. Parents sacrifice so their children never go without. And yet, here I was, discarded with a $50 bill. Humiliation twisted inside me, but beneath it, something else began to stir. Anger, sharp and focused. I stared at the bill for a long moment, then slowly reached out and picked it up. My fingers didn't tremble. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and said nothing. In my head, my voice was clear. I won't give them the tears they want. Eleanor Roosevelt's words returned to me. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you stop to look fear in the face. I had just stared fear straight in its eyes and refused to flinch. My father thought he had dismissed me, reduced me to nothing. He didn't realize he'd just handed me a weapon. That $50 bill wasn't humiliation anymore. It was evidence, a story. Proof of his cruelty, proof of Barbara's theater, proof that they would go to any lengths to erase me. Inside, humiliation hardened into resolve. Bitterness fueled quiet defiance. I wasn't crushed. I was crystallized. When the meal ended, I pushed back the broken chair. The scrape of its legs against the floor echoed in the hall. I stood tall, smoothing my dress as though I hadn't just been handed an insult in front of half the neighborhood. Barbara's voice rang out as I walked toward the door. "Don't forget your chair," she called, laughter dancing in her tone. The guests chuckled, a chorus of cruelty. I didn't turn back. I walked out into the night air, fists clenched inside my coat pockets, the folded bill burning against my skin. The sky was wide and dark, stars faint against the city's glow. I drew in a breath and let it out slowly, feeling the humiliation sink into the ground beneath my feet, leaving only resolve in its place. Humiliation can crush you or crystallize you. That night, I chose the latter. Families fracture over money every day. But when they choose cruelty on top of greed, when they humiliate their own in front of others, those scars last longer than any loss of inheritance. I walked down the street, every step louder in my mind than the applause inside that house. My father had thrown money at me as though I were garbage, and Barbara had mocked me with a smile. But as I pressed the wrinkled $50 tighter in my hand, I swore to myself they would never laugh at me again. After that dinner, with Barbara's laughter echoing in my ears and the weight of that wrinkled bill burning in my pocket, I knew I couldn't just sit in silence anymore. I needed answers, facts, not feelings. My humiliation had been public, but I suspected the damage went much deeper than broken chairs and cruel jokes. Something larger was happening behind the curtains, and if I didn't uncover it, my father's sudden fortune would become Barbara's weapon forever. So I called Cheryl, my mother's old friend. She'd been a steady presence when Mom was alive, visiting for coffee, sometimes offering free advice when bills stacked up. Now she was a seasoned attorney in Dallas, sharp and respected. I drove to her office the next morning. The space smelled of strong coffee and fresh paper, with files stacked high on her desk, evidence of battles she'd fought for people who didn't have the power to defend themselves. I told her everything. I described Barbara's calculated smile, the way Dad signed papers without reading them, the neighbors' whispers that painted me as jealous and unstable. Cheryl listened carefully, nodding without interruption, her pen scratching notes onto a yellow legal pad. Finally, she leaned back and tapped her glasses against the desk. "Courtney, I've seen this pattern before. Let's check the records." She logged into a state database, her fingers moving quickly. She pulled up the lottery filings, the property deeds, new contracts my father had signed in just the last 2 weeks. Each document hit me like another slap. Barbara's fingerprints were everywhere. Sudden transfers of property, new accounts opened in her name as co-signer, even clauses written to bypass oversight. My stomach knotted as Cheryl read aloud. "The devil is in the details," she said grimly, sliding one paper across the desk. "And the details show your sister isn't just celebrating, she's consolidating. She's tying your father's fortune and his future directly to herself." Suspicion solidified into dread. Paperwork, not just cruelty at a dinner table, was where my family's betrayal lived. Cheryl pulled out one contract that chilled me more than the rest. It was labeled Investment Partnership Agreement. My father's signature sprawled across the bottom, but the terms were terrifying. "Look here," she said, pointing at the fine print. Most of the assets are funneled into Barbara's control. He's technically still the owner on paper, but in practice, he's given away his independence. She can move funds, authorize loans, even sell property, all with his signature already recorded. I stared at the page, my hands trembling. He didn't understand this. He probably thought he was agreeing to a business opportunity. Cheryl's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. Courtney, this isn't favoritism. It's exploitation. She's turning your father into a puppet. Anger and fear twisted inside me. I had already lost my place in his heart. Now I realized I was watching him lose his freedom too. This wasn't just about me being erased. It was about him being controlled until nothing of the man I knew was left. I thought of all the seniors I'd heard about in the news, people who signed away rights without realizing until it was too late. They became shadows in their own homes, trapped by those they trusted most. I never imagined my father would join them. But here we were. Shaken, I left Cheryl's office and drove straight to my bank. I needed cash, something small to keep me steady at the motel. I handed my card to the teller, expecting a routine withdrawal. Instead, she frowned, tapping the screen. "I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson," she said carefully, her voice rehearsed like she'd had this conversation before. "Your account has been frozen." I blinked. Frozen? That's impossible. It's my account. My savings. She lowered her voice. It's been restricted under a guardianship filing. Your father is listed as having financial authority. Legally, I can't release funds. The world tilted. Guardianship? I'm 32 years old. I don't need a guardian. She looked apologetic, but helpless. The paperwork is valid. Unless it's contested in court, my hands are tied. I argued, but it was useless. Rules bound her, and I walked out with nothing. Fear clawed at my chest. If they could cut me off from even my modest savings, what came next? My independence was hanging by a thread. Barbara wasn't just controlling my father, she was reaching into my pockets too. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, heart racing. I thought about how family law in this country sometimes overlaps with elder abuse, how easily control can be twisted to serve greed. I realized I needed to be smarter, not louder. If I screamed, they'd call me unstable again. If I stayed silent, they'd bury me under paperwork. But if I planned, if I played their game better, maybe I could turn it around. Back at the motel, I emptied my wallet onto the bed. A few crumpled bills, some coins, nothing else. Cornered, yes, but cornered animals learn to fight smarter. I opened my notebook and wrote at the top of a page, "If they're using the law to erase me, I'll use the law to expose them." The fear was still there, but under it something harder began to form. I remembered Franklin D. Roosevelt's words. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. I closed my eyes and repeated it like a vow. Barbara thought she'd ended me by freezing my account. She had no idea she'd just unlocked something stronger. She had forced me into desperation, and desperation sharpens resolve like nothing else. After discovering my bank account frozen and the law twisted against me, I tried calling my father. Part of me still hoped there was a trace of humanity left in him, that he would pick up the phone and remember that I was his daughter. I dialed once, twice, and then again. Each time the call failed. Confused, I tried from a different line, but the message came back the same. The number no longer recognized mine. A knot formed in my throat as realization hit me. My number wasn't blocked by accident. It had been deleted, erased. I sat staring at my phone, the silence louder than any argument. My father hadn't just turned his back on me. He had erased me digitally, surgically removing me from his life with a press of a button. Days later, when I caught a glimpse of his phone in Barbara's hands, I saw his wallpaper. It wasn't a family photo of us all together, It wasn't even of him alone. It was Barbara standing next to him with her perfect smile, his arm around her like she was the only child he ever had. I wasn't in the picture, literally and figuratively. Americans often say, out of sight, out of mind. But nothing could prepare me for the sting of seeing that from my own parent. That small act of erasure hurt more than being thrown out with 2 suitcases. Paperwork and contracts are one thing, but when your parent rewrites the family photo, it pierces deeper than any legal betrayal. I thought the cruelty had peaked. I was wrong. At a community gathering not long after, my young niece spotted me from across the room. She came running with all the innocence of childhood, her little hands reaching for mine. For a second, warmth flooded me. I thought maybe love still existed somewhere in this fractured family. Then she looked up and said, in the clearest voice, "Mommy told me you're not in the family anymore." Is that true? The words hit harder than any insult Barbara had ever thrown my way. I froze, unable to answer. Children don't lie, they repeat. My father and Barbara had planted this truth in her head, shaping her reality before she could even understand what loyalty meant. I forced a smile and bent down, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups say things that aren't fair." But inside, I was splintering. Protecting her innocence meant swallowing another shard of my own heartbreak. In America, children often reveal the truth of adult cruelty without knowing it. They are mirrors, innocent enough to reflect what's said at dinner tables and whispered behind closed doors. I walked away quietly, but another piece of my heart hardened as I did. That night, back in the motel, I replayed the events in a loop. The deleted number, the replaced photo, the child's knife of innocence cutting without meaning to. Despair tried to drag me down again, its grip cold and heavy, but anger rose alongside it, refusing to let me sink. I stared at the cracked ceiling and told myself aloud, if even the children are being taught to erase me, I can't just defend myself anymore. I must fight back. In grief groups, I had once heard a phrase that stayed with me. Trauma not transformed is trauma transferred. I understood it now. Barbara wasn't only poisoning my father, she was planting seeds of erasure into the next generation. If I didn't transform this pain, it would ripple through the family long after me. The grief in my chest slowly shifted into determination. My tears dried into something sharper. Betrayal wasn't going to end me. It was going to fuel me. At the motel desk, I spread out every scrap of paper I had, every note I'd scribbled from Cheryl's advice, every observation I had of Barbara's moves. It felt like I was building a case, not just for myself, but for the truth itself. I began drafting a timeline. The night of the lottery win, the staged dinner, the contract slipped beneath laughter, the freezing of my account, the words whispered by a child too young to know she was delivering a weapon. Each entry made Barbara's moves less invisible. I leaned back, my pen tapping the page, and whispered to myself, "She thinks I'm erased, but I'm about to write myself back into this story." My resolve settled in, cold and steady. Barbara thought her erasure was final, that the family picture was complete without me. What she didn't know was that she had just declared war. I sat at the motel desk, a lamp buzzing weakly above me, casting more shadows than light. My papers were scattered across the surface, bank slips, scribbled notes, memories written in haste before they could fade. Cheryl's voice echoed in my head, as though she were standing right beside me. "Document everything, Courtney. Truth is your only weapon." So I did. I listed every date that mattered, every conversation that revealed a crack in Barbara's facade, every document I had glimpsed with my father's hurried signature on it. I even wrote down the smallest moments, her whispered words, her smug glances, the times she handed him papers like napkins at a dinner party. To anyone else, it might have looked like paranoia, but I knew patterns were the foundation of proof. If Barbara thinks she can outplay me, I whispered to the empty room, she's mistaken. I know her patterns now. For the first time in weeks, suspicion felt less like poison and more like power. I realized how many cases like mine are lost, not because the betrayal wasn't real, but because the victims never kept track. They stayed silent until the lies swallowed them whole. I vowed I wouldn't be one of them. The devil really was in the details, and this time, the details would be mine to wield. But as the night stretched on, exhaustion crept in. The glow of the motel lamp blurred, and the lines of my notes swam in front of my eyes. My wallet sat open on the bed, nearly empty. My savings were frozen, my family had erased me, and now I was living night to night in a room where the air smelled like mildew. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling as if the cracked plaster could provide answers. The thought cut me raw. Maybe they were right. Maybe I am nothing. Hopelessness pressed against my chest. I whispered into the stillness, maybe I should just give in. But then another voice rose inside me. Winston Churchill's line that I had once underlined in a library book years ago. If you're going through hell, keep going. The words kept me from collapsing entirely. I repeated them like a rope I could grip in the dark. If I stopped now, I'd be handing Barbara exactly what she wanted. Still, despair lingered like smoke until I remembered something I had nearly forgotten. I dug through my bag and pulled out a small wooden box, scuffed from years of being carried, but never opened. Inside lay my mother's necklace, the one I always wore when I needed courage, and beneath it, an envelope sealed in her handwriting. My breath caught as I slid my finger under the flap. The letter inside was short, written in her steady script. Courtney, if your father forgets justice, you must be the one to remember. The words pierced through the fog of despair like sunlight breaking storm clouds. My mother had known. She had seen the seeds of weakness, perhaps even the danger of Barbara's ambition. She hadn't written to my sister. She hadn't written to my father. She had written to me. Bitterness shifted inside me, reshaped into strength. My grief became fuel. I clutched the necklace to my chest, whispering, I won't let you down, Mom. Not now, not ever. The motel room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a war room. I pulled the papers back toward me, the despair of an hour ago replaced with clarity. I mapped out a plan, gather more financial evidence, document every forged step, and bring Cheryl into the loop as my ally. Barbara's empire wasn't made of stone, it was made of paper, and paper burns fast when truth sets the spark. Barbara wanted to erase me, I said quietly, the necklace warm in my hand. Instead, she's about to write me into every page of this story. The pace of my thoughts quickened. My hand moved faster across the paper. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. Determination had taken its place. I leaned back finally, exhaustion in my bones but steel in my chest. I had thought I'd lost everything, my family, my home, my name, but with my mother's letter in hand, I realized I had just found my weapon. The call from Cheryl came on a Tuesday morning, sunlight spilling into my motel room through curtains too thin to block anything. Her voice was steady, precise, but I could hear the weight in every word. Courtney, your mother was smarter than all of them. She made sure the guardianship clauses leaned in your favor. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mother, gone all these years, had still been protecting me. Cheryl explained that the court had accepted her filing to freeze the lottery funds, citing suspicious transfers tied to Barbara. The accounts were no longer Barbara's playground. They were suspended until further notice. The news rippled through the family like a crack in glass. My father was stunned, pacing the living room of the house that used to be mine, his hands shaking as Barbara whispered reassurances. But even he knew what it meant. For the first time, Barbara wasn't in control. I sat at Cheryl's desk as she handed me the document. "You're not powerless anymore," she said firmly. "Legally, the ball is in your court." Her words echoed in my mind as I stared at the stamped papers. Shock spread through me, but alongside it was a taste of something I hadn't felt in weeks: vindication. The tables had turned, just like the old American phrase I'd heard growing up. I wasn't erased anymore. I was stepping back into the story, pen in hand. That weekend, a community event was held at the park. My father arrived with Barbara at his side, dressed in expensive clothes that screamed new money. She paraded him around like a trophy, smiling for photos with neighbors. For weeks, she had been painting herself as the perfect daughter. But whispers had started to spread since the news of the frozen accounts. People were curious, skeptical. The moment that sealed her unraveling came when she unveiled a framed family photo. She stood proudly on the stage, holding it high. It showed her and my father, smiling broadly, surrounded by decorations from their newly renovated house. My face was nowhere in sight. The crowd murmured. A neighbor called out, "Where's Courtney? Shouldn't she be in the picture?" Barbara laughed nervously. "Oh, it was just a quick photo, nothing official." Her tone faltered, and I saw it. The first crack in her polished image. My father looked uncomfortable, his smile fading as people whispered around him. Anger burned in me, but for once it didn't consume me. Instead, I felt a cold satisfaction. For so long, erasure had been my private pain. Now, it was public, undeniable. Americans value reputation, sometimes more than money, and Barbara's reputation, her carefully built facade, was collapsing in front of everyone. I remembered Abraham Lincoln's words, "Character is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing." Barbara's shadow had looked flawless. But now everyone was realizing the tree was rotting. The whispers grew. Why would she erase her own sister? Isn't this about the lottery money? Neighbors stopped looking at me with pity and started looking at Barbara with suspicion. Between the frozen funds and that photo, the tide shifted. I could feel it. For the first time since this nightmare began, power wasn't in her hands. I watched my father closely. His eyes darted, his confidence in Barbara wavering. He didn't defend her as quickly as he had before. Doubt had slipped in, and doubt was all I needed. Inside, my thoughts were clear. For the first time, Barbara felt what I had felt all along. Erased, doubted, exposed. Justice wasn't complete yet, but it was starting to surface. The crowd wasn't whispering about me anymore. They were whispering about Barbara's greed. That night, I sat across from Cheryl in her office again. We spread out documents under the lamplight, piecing together the next step. "It's time to escalate," Cheryl said. "We can take this to court. We can take this to the press. Let the truth burn through their lies." I nodded, my hand steady on the papers. "I'm not the forgotten daughter anymore," I said, almost to myself. "I'm becoming the storm they never saw coming." Determination hardened inside me. This wasn't just survival now. It was justice, and justice had my mother's fingerprints all over it. Barbara thought she had rewritten the story without me. What she didn't know was that I had the final draft in my hands. When I arrived at my office early that morning, the air felt different, thick with anticipation I couldn't yet name. But the moment I saw him sitting on the steps, everything snapped into focus. My father was there, the same man who had thrown me out into the night with 2 suitcases, his pride dripping from every word. Now, he sat slumped in his expensive suit, tie loosened, eyes swollen from tears. His hair, once meticulously combed, looked unkempt. He looked less like the patriarch who strutted through life and more like a man begging for scraps of mercy. He stood the moment he saw me, stumbling forward, hands shaking. "Courtney, please, I need your help." They froze everything. The words hung in the morning air. 4 days ago, he told me I was nothing. 4 days ago, he handed me humiliation like it was dinner bread. And now, here he was, crying outside my office doors. Shock rippled through me. I felt pity rise, yes, but alongside it was a sharper sensation: justice. For all the times he had ignored me, belittled me, erased me, the sight of him here was both tragic and powerful. In America, we talk about fathers as unshakable rocks, providers, protectors. To see one brought low in public strips away every illusion. Pride had collapsed right in front of me. "Courtney," he pleaded again, his voice cracking. "I don't know what happened. The bank, the accounts, they said I can't touch a dime." His hands shook as if the words themselves were heavier than he could carry. I held the office door, looking down at him, torn between the daughter in me who once needed his approval and the woman who knew justice when she saw it. Instead of rushing to his side, I let him sit. I walked past him, unlocked my office, and left the door closed. He sank back onto the steps, defeated. Hours went by. My colleagues and clients came and went, glancing at the spectacle outside, whispering. Dahlia, my coworker, leaned over my desk with raised brows. "Is that really your father? What on earth happened?" I kept my tone calm, almost detached. "That's the same man who told me I was useless. Now he waits to see if I'll acknowledge him." The humiliation he once inflicted on me was reflected back onto him. He had given me humiliation as currency, and now I was returning it, with interest. From the window, I watched. His posture sagged lower as the day wore on, sweat dampening his shirt, neighbors slowing as they passed. Whispers grew louder. The once proud patriarch, reduced to waiting for scraps of attention from the daughter he had erased. Finally, near midday, I stepped outside. The crowd had thinned, but enough eyes lingered to make the moment sharp. He rose quickly, stumbling toward me. "Courtney, please, I was wrong. I shouldn't have listened to Barbara. I shouldn't have shut you out. But you have to help me now, before she ruins me completely." I let the silence stretch, feeling every eye on us. "You told me to leave overnight," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Now you'll wait until I decide if you still have a place in this world." It was the mic drop moment I hadn't even realized I'd been waiting for. Triumph surged through me, not giddy, but hard and resolute. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about balance restored. I remembered Maya Angelou's words, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them." My father had shown me. I would never unsee it, never forget it. Inside the office windows, colleagues leaned subtly, pretending to check their phones but watching every second. No one said a word, but their eyes told me they understood. Power had shifted, and everyone saw it. The next day, the Houston Chronicle splashed the headline across its front page: "Lottery Family Fortune Frozen Amid Fraud Allegations." The article painted Barbara in the light she had feared most, not as the perfect daughter, but as the manipulator linked to financial misconduct. The photo beneath the headline sealed it: Barbara, smiling wide as if nothing were wrong, and my father, visibly nervous beside her. My name was absent again, but this time, the absence raised questions. People wondered aloud why I had been erased, what they were hiding. At the grocery store, whispers floated past me. "Isn't that Courtney? Why would they cut her out?" I heard the money's frozen, something shady's going on. For once, I wasn't the one being doubted. Barbara's perfect image was collapsing under the weight of truth. I felt satisfaction rise. Vindication wasn't private anymore. It was public. In this country, reputation can vanish faster than fortune. My family had chosen greed, but now it was their faces on the front page, their shame laid bare for all to see. I looked at the paper one last time and folded it neatly. Barbara thought the law was her shield, I said softly to myself. She was about to learn it was my sword. I went to see my father again, not because I believed he had changed, but because part of me still needed to hear it from his lips, that maybe he was ready to admit Barbara's poison had clouded his judgment. I wanted to see even a glimmer of the man who had once tucked me into bed, who once told me he'd always protect me. Instead, what I received was a blade sharper than any eviction, deeper than any frozen account. He looked at me square in the eyes, his voice steady but cold, and said, "I don't have a youngest daughter." The silence that followed pressed in like a weight. I felt the room itself pause, holding its breath. My father hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The dismissal in his tone carved into me as if he were cutting my name out of the family tree with a knife. In this country, parents are supposed to stand guard over their children, protecting them until their final breath. Hearing the opposite, hearing my father declare that I no longer existed in his world, was a devastation I can't compare. My ears rang, and for a long moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I left without another word. His pride was all he had left, and he chose it over reconciliation. That choice was final. Days later, my phone buzzed with a message from Barbara. It was a photo, her leaning against a brand new luxury car, sunglasses perched on her face like a crown. The caption underneath read, "We won. You're nothing." I stared at it until my hands shook. Anger rose, not the kind that shatters you, but the kind that steals you. She wanted me erased, humiliated, forgotten. But every insult she threw was more evidence of who she really was: greedy, shallow, and cruel. Money doesn't change people, I whispered to myself. It unmasks them. Barbara's mask had slipped long ago. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. I let the fury settle into fuel. I began to see things clearly. Reconciliation was a dream I could no longer afford to keep. Whatever my father and Barbara had destroyed, it wasn't coming back. They had severed the tie, and it was time I stopped trying to knot it back together. The pain in my chest softened, not because it disappeared, but because it transformed into liberation. I was free from the illusion of family loyalty. I thought of all the people in this country who have felt the sting of betrayal from blood, the sting that cuts deeper because it comes from those meant to stand beside you. Survival for us isn't about mending what's broken. It's about building our own foundations, brick by brick, even if we must do it alone. I sat across from Cheryl later that week, my case files spread wide across her desk. She looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Are you ready to take this all the way?" I nodded. I'm done waiting for them to recognize me. Now, I want the law to recognize what they've done. Practical steps grounded me. Drafting filings, preparing evidence, piecing together every shred of manipulation and fraud Barbara had left in her trail. Each document became another stone in the wall I was building. Not to keep myself out, but to keep them from trampling me again. At the motel, I took one more step that felt final. I wrote a letter to myself. In it, I declared that I would no longer seek their validation, no longer measure myself by their acceptance. The letter wasn't long, but it was mine, and every word felt like reclaiming a piece of my own dignity. They took me out of their story, I whispered, setting down my pen. Now, I'll write my own. Liberation is never easy, but sometimes the strongest act of strength is cutting the rope that binds you to pain. I recalled Maya Angelou's line, "I can be changed by what happens to me." But I refused to be reduced by it. As I sealed the letter and tucked it away, I felt something inside me release. The tie had been cut. The family I once fought to belong to was gone, But in its place, I found something better, myself. The rope was cut. But in cutting it, I finally had both hands free to fight. Walking into the courthouse that morning, I felt the weight of every humiliation that had led me here. The eviction, the frozen accounts, the erased photos, the sneers passed off as family jokes. Cheryl walked beside me, her briefcase full of evidence, while I carried a folder heavy enough to bend my wrist. But what it carried was heavier still, the truth. The hall smelled of old wood and coffee. The marble floors echoed each of our steps as we entered the courtroom. Barbara was already seated at the defense table, dressed to impress, designer suit immaculate, her lips curled into that same confident smile she had worn the day my father shoved me out. She leaned back like a queen waiting for her audience. My father sat beside her, but the fire had left his eyes. He looked hollow, more spectator than participant, unsure which side he was supposed to be on anymore. The proceedings began. One by one, the evidence unfolded. Forged signatures, bank transfers to accounts Barbara had concealed, testimony from financial advisors who admitted they had been pressured to look the other way. Piece by piece, her glittering image unraveled. I remembered a line I once heard. Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. As the courtroom absorbed document after document, witness after witness, I saw that truth taking form in real time. The tension hung thick in the air. For years, Barbara had spun her lies unchecked, but today, under oath and under scrutiny, they fell apart. Then came the judge's ruling, clear and resounding. Barbara was guilty of fraud and financial exploitation. The guardianship my father had filed over me was declared void, stripped away as unlawful. My accounts were restored. Barbara's assets seized. Part of the fortune was officially returned to me. Barbara's face, pale now, twisted with fury. She leaned close as the courtroom emptied and hissed, "This isn't over." I met her eyes, calm and cold. "For you, it just ended." Vindication surged. Not wild, but pure, steady. The predator had been exposed. The manipulator defeated. In America, few crimes cut deeper than financial betrayal within a family. But when justice is served, it feels almost poetic. The momentum had reached its peak, and Barbara's empire had collapsed under the weight of her own greed. When I stepped outside into the Texas sun, I felt lighter than I had in months. The heat pressed down, but for once it didn't suffocate. It freed. Cheryl clapped my shoulder. "You did it!" But justice wasn't the end of my story. As we walked down the courthouse steps, my father tried to follow. His steps were slow, his voice almost pleading. "Courtney, please. I made mistakes. I let her control me. Can you forgive me?" I turned to face him, the man who had chosen pride over me at every turn. My voice was calm, my heart clear. "You chose your pride over your daughter. That's your burden now, not mine." His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the man I once loved, but I didn't waver. Some ties, once severed, can't be retied without leaving scars that never heal. As I walked forward, people I had known all my life, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers, watched me with different eyes. Respect. Recognition. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was no longer the erased daughter. I was a woman who had stood up against betrayal and won. There's a saying I've carried with me since. Sometimes the family you lose is the freedom you gain. That day, I finally understood it. In the weeks that followed, I turned my focus to something greater than myself. I opened a small legal aid fund in my mother's honor, dedicated to protecting seniors and children from financial abuse within families. I wanted others to have the shield I never did, to know they weren't alone when greed and manipulation tried to consume them. On the day of its opening, I stood before a modest crowd, Cheryl at my side, and said, "My mother told me once to remember justice when others forgot. Today, I fulfill that promise." Later, when I was alone in my office, I held her necklace in my hand and thought of Maya Angelou's words. "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It had become purpose. They thought they had erased me. Instead, I wrote myself into history with a pen dipped in truth.